Bernardi here, and in this video we are going to talk about what is cognitive psychology. This is a very interesting field of research. Basically what a cognitive psychologist does is study cognition. We're going to talk about how cognitive psychologists explore your thinking and cognition in everyday tasks that you do every day. And really the field involves thinking and other mental processes. So we could talk about perception, how people perceive the world, how people interpret the world, attention, what brain areas are involved with attention. Also, by the way, what brain areas are involved with memory and perception and how memories are stored. And we'll talk about false memories and maybe your memory is not as good as you think it is. We'll also discuss language and how we acquire language, and we'll talk about Broca's area and Wernicke's area, which are parts of the brain that involve language and how language is processed. And maybe a little bit later we'll talk about if animals have language. That's an interesting question. We'll talk about how you make decisions. What goes on in your brain when you make a decision? And finally, we'll look at ways we can measure brain activity. We have various techniques that we could use, like positron emission topography, or we have EEGs. We have quite a, or fMRIs or MRIs. We have quite a few different mechanisms that we can use, and we'll discuss those at least a little bit in this video and further on in my series. So we have to think about the roots, right? Where did the roots of cognitive psychology come from? And if you think about it, a lot of our psychology, whether we're talking cognitive psychology or actually the field in general, really drew its inspiration from Aristotle. Aristotle, I mean, he was more of a philosopher, but we could really trace our roots all the way back to Aristotle's work. We can also take a look at Wundt, or Wilhelm Wundt, and he studied consciousness and conscious experiences, and he wanted to really know about thoughts, images, and feelings, and he really formed the basis of what we study today in cognitive psychology. So if we really want to think about exactly where cognitive psychology is traced back to, that's really traced back to Wilhelm Wundt. And then we could talk about Skinner, which is interesting because he actually studied language, but he said all language had to be learned and that, there was nothing going on in the mind. It was a black box and nobody could really understand the mind, so let's not worry about it. But Noam Chomsky was a linguist, and he argued that, well, language every phrase can't be learned because kids say words that parents never do, like mom, go store. You would never hear an adult say that, but little kids would say that. So Noam Chomsky said we must have a language acquisition device that helps us acquire language. And we don't have to memorize every word that everybody says, as the behavioralists believed. It's all about, with them, it's like you can't study the mind, don't worry about it. But Noam Chomsky said, no, there is some kind of mechanism that is innate in us that we're born with. And then we can also look at Hermann Ebbinghaus, and he studied memory and how memory works. Again, these are just the early fields of cognitive psychology and where cognitive psychology really got its roots. The other thing that really influenced cognitive psychology was the development of the computer. So early on, right when those computers really burst onto the scene in the 1960s and 1970s, they were around a little bit longer than that, but they were giant and they were vacuum tubes in the 1940s and 50s. But really think about when the computers really burst onto the scenes and how we started to make analogies from the brain to computing, and how we thought that the brain worked like a computer. We broke things up into memory and long-term memory and short-term memory like a computer, like, working memory like RAM, and long-term memory was like your hard drive. And we tried to make that model. And we even have models called the information processing model, which we'll go into in my cognitive psychology lecture series videos. But the term cognitive psychology wasn't really coined until a little bit later on, when we actually use the word cognitive psychology. And, cognitive psychology is not an isolated field. It really ties into both biology and philosophy. So they're all intertwined here, especially when we talk about cognition, what makes you you. We can approach it from a biological perspective, like we can look at certain parts of the brain and which parts of the brain are involved in creating consciousness. And even a philosophical question comes up, like how do you describe taste and what is taste or smell or color, right? That's a little more abstract, and we'll get into that, and there's a whole term for that. So stay tuned. And the other thing that arose from the information processing models of cognition, remember, comparing our brains to computers, was this idea that our brains are represented in our minds, right? And our brains operate on representations. That our brains have basically cognitive schemas, basically mental models about how the world works. That's really huge in the field of cognitive psychology. And over time, as we experience the world, our brains build up better and better mental models that help us operate and understand the world around us. The other thing you have to think about is our brains aren't just floating around. Yes, we have a brain, we have a mind. We'll talk about dualism and monoism a little bit later on, but that our brains are embedded. So our brains, our cognition is involved with how we interact with the world. And in this lecture series, I will show you the rubber hand phenomenon, and that's a very interesting phenomenon where people will believe that the rubber hand is theirs. And everything we do, right, is in context. And this will have very interesting implications for virtual reality. So I don't know if anybody who watches my videos into VR, and we can get into cognition and how we interact with the virtual world, which is a fascinating conversation. The other perspective I really want you guys to think about is the biological perspective, right? We could talk about which parts of the brain are associated with different cognitive processes, right? So what parts of your brain, for example, are involved with attention? The prefrontal cortex, right? And what part of your brain is involved with memory? Primarily the hippocampus, but again, memories are spread out through the whole brain. So we have a lot to discuss in this video series. So the scientific method is really grounded on 4 principles, and that is empiricism, which is just systematic observation of the world. Determinism, all behaviors have underlying causes, that's part of it. Testability, that theories must be able to be proven false, or falsifiability is another word I've used. And basically, you have to be able to test, observe, and prove your theories false through observation. There are a lot of quote-unquote theories out there that are not testable, like Ancient Aliens. Have you guys ever seen that TV show? You can't really test for those theories. Or Ghost Hunters or Ghost Adventures. You can't really test for ghosts, but we're talking about testable, falsifiable theories. And then parsimony, meaning usually the simple explanation are usually the best over the more complex ones, right? So, for example, if you ever watched that show Ancient Aliens, which I used to watch when I was younger, they would say that the aliens built the pyramids and the aliens came down here in spaceships and blah, 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 blah. There was a lot of building blocks that they needed to happen, right, for those aliens to build those pyramids. However, the most simplest explanation is parsimony, that the Egyptians just built them. By the way, it's a non-falsifiable question, so we didn't even ask it. A couple other terms that you have to note are what a dependent variable is. That's the variable that we are interested in, the one that actually is being measured. The other term you have to know is the independent variable, and that's the variable that we manipulate or have control over, and it changes, well, I should say this, it causes the change in the dependent variable. And all research begins with predictions about the relationship between these variables. So know these terms, dependent and independent variables. Another type of research that we do in the field are case studies. Now, case studies are more in-depth looks at something as opposed to experimental designs where we manipulate. So the last slide was really about experimental design. This is more about, looking at the individual patient. There was a very famous one, Phineas Gage, where he got a railroad spike through his head and his personality and his behaviors changed. That was a case study. It was an in-depth analysis. There's another patient who had memory issues. HM was his code name, and we'll talk more about him. And that is an in-depth analysis of people, usually individual. It could be more than one individual, but usually it's just one individual. Now here's some advantages with case studies. Now, researchers can gather a large amount of intense observations. However, right, so when you do a case study, you can get very, very in-depth with your research. You could study somebody, you could follow somebody for months, years, whatever it might be, get some really good information, really good and intense, deep observations. However, you're only looking at one person. And in the field of research, one person is not generalizable because you're only banking on one person. In my research methods courses, the joke was sample size of 1 or n equals 1. You never really want to do that from a statistics perspective because, again, you need a large sample to make generalized statements about the larger population. You also have correlational studies, right? So this is not manipulating anything. There's no independent or dependent variables here. This allows you to observe systematically groups of people. You might indirectly measure something or you might directly measure something, depending. Often it's indirect measurements like through surveys, right, or observations of behaviors. You could do that way too. We don't usually have a lot of impact here, so there's no manipulation of variables. But the awesome thing about this is you have a lot of what we call ecological validity, because often these case studies, or these, as I should say, these correlational studies happen in the context they're occurring. So they're high in ecological validity, but they're low in internal validity, meaning we can't infer causality. There's no control of the study, right? We don't know potentially what else could influence the study. So always be wary when you see correlational studies if anybody is jumping to a cause and effect, because you can't draw that. The only way you can draw a cause and effect is through experimental research. Now, experimental studies, as I mentioned earlier, that's where you'll see the independent and dependent variable. Now, normally, we have very complex surrounding behaviors of interest, and usually this involves that manipulation of variables. So you'll see that independent and dependent variables. That's the thing we talked about earlier, right? The variable you're measuring is your dependent variable. The one you're manipulating is your independent variable. And often they can have one or more than one independent and more than one dependent variable with various levels. But the great thing about experimental studies is especially with true experiments where you can have random assignment, simple random assignment, now you can infer cause and effect. You can say A causes B, because again, you're manipulating, controlling, and ruling out any extraneous variables that might influence your research study. One important thing to know about whatever research you're doing is you want your research methods to be sound, and you want your measures that you pick, if you're doing like a survey, right, to have accuracy. So one thing we really care about is internal validity of our research study or of our measures. So we care about validity of our instruments, and we'll get into various types besides internal validity. We have criterion validity, we have face validity, we have multiple types, but you also care about reliability. And does that instrument do the same thing over time? So if you give somebody a test at time 1, is the same thing at time 2, right? So we're interested in our measures being both valid and reliable. We also look at accuracy, right? So it'll look at right or wrong responses, right? So we might want to see how accurate somebody is. This research happens with false memories, right? So we can maybe make up a memory, get somebody to believe it, and then see how many inaccurate things they remember. We'll get into this a little bit later in the series. We can also look at response time. How long does it take an individual to respond to a stimulus? We can also talk about priming. So if I prime you to think about something, does that change how you respond? Or I can also look at eye movements. And we could use something like a Tobii eye tracker to see where you're looking. By the way, this is also becoming very popular in virtual reality as well, eye tracking. But we will get into much more detail. Now, besides accuracy and time response research, those are the most popular. But There's also research that looks off the trade-off between speed and accuracy, because usually the faster you go, the less accurate you are, and the slower you go, usually the more accurate you are. We could also look at duration, velocity, or direction of movement. So we could look at various other cognitive processes. We can also look at brain visualization, right? How you visualize something in your mind when I ask you to think about it, or what parts of your brain light up. So there's a whole field out there that's kind of really burgeoning, especially with the technology we have now for brain imaging. One thing that we often use for brain imaging is EEGs. You could also use functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRIs. Again, both of these allow researchers to visualize brain activity, and we'll get into more detail. And we can also combine this with our accuracy research and our response time research, which we'll go into much more detail in this lecture series. One thing I want to tell everybody, especially who watch my videos, right? Everything we're looking at here is indirect measurements. Whether we're talking brain imaging or giving somebody a survey or looking at response times or looking at how long someone gazes at something using Tobii eye trackers, this is all indirect measurements that we try to correlate with some kind of cognitive processes. But correlation does not always imply causation, right? Now we evaluate assumed connections between measured behavior and inferred cognitive processes. That's what we do in the cognitive sciences. So I always want to tell individuals to be cautious whenever you're interpreting brain image studies. With that said, I'll see everybody in the next video. Like, subscribe, and share. I'll see y'all next time. Take care. Bye-bye.